Hey there movie lovers, welcome back to Rocky Watches Movies. Today we're taking a trip back to the golden age of British comedy with the legendary Carry On films. Spanning over 3 decades, this beloved series delivered cheeky humour, outrageous innuendos, and some of the most recognisable faces in British cinema. But behind the laughs and double entendres lies a treasure trove of fascinating stories, surprising facts, and a few on-set mishaps that even the lifelong fans might not know about. So grab your bowler hat, keep a stiff upper lip, and let's dive into 20 things you never knew about the Carry On films. The Carry On films were known for their notoriously low budgets and rapid production schedules. For instance, Carry On Columbus from 1992 was the most expensive, costing £2.5 million, while Carry On Nurse from 1959 was the least, at just £71,000. The film productions were usually completed in a matter of weeks. For example, Carry On Behind was shot between March the 10th and April the 18th in 1975, a period of roughly 6 weeks. The franchise was known for featuring many of the same actors, though not all of them got along. The most infamous feud was between Kenneth Williams and Sid James. Williams reportedly disapproved of James's acting skills, while James grew irritated by Williams' attention-seeking behaviour. Williams also clashed with Charles Hawtrey, whose alcoholism and resulting unreliability caused tension on set. Jim Dale, meanwhile, got on well with his fellow cast members, but was not close friends with them, preferring family life over nights out. According to Dale, his colleagues were so offended that he had chosen stage work over appearing in Carry On Up the Jungle that they snubbed his appearance on This Is Your Life. In the Carry On series, there was a notable disparity in pay between the male and female lead actors, reflecting broader industry norms of the time. Male leads often earned around £5,000 per film, a substantial sum in the context of the 1960s and 70s, while their female counterparts typically received roughly half that amount. Charles Hawtrey, one of the most beloved and recognisable faces of the Carry On series, ultimately had to be fired from the films due to his increasingly severe alcohol problems. His struggles with drinking became so bad that on the set of Carry On Abroad, he reportedly needed the physical support of his fellow cast members just to stand and perform. When Sid James was unavailable for Carry On Follow That Camel, American comedian Phil Silvers was brought in to replace him as the Sergeant Major. The casting was a deliberate attempt to help the franchise break into the American market, with promotional material even referencing Silver's well-known role as Sergeant Bilko. However, despite the effort, the film failed to attract attention in the US. Hattie Jacks is best known for her role as the apron matron in the hospital-based Carry On films, a part well suited to her real-life experience as a nurse. At the outbreak of the Second World War, she joined the Voluntary Aid Detachment, VAD, and served in a mobile unit in London, tending to bombed sites during the Blitz. The primary recurring cast members were all British, with the exception of Sid James, who was born and raised in South Africa, but often played Cockneys, making him a fake Brit. Many of the cast portrayed a range of other nationalities throughout the series, usually without altering their accents. Carry On Cowboy was a notable exception, as the entire cast adopted American accents of varying quality. However, Jim Dale's character remained British, and Charles Hawtrey, whose portrayal of an Indian chief created humour through its sheer absurdity. Bernard Bresslaw combined absurdity with blackface or brownface in several films, appearing as a Native American in Carry On Cowboy, an Arab in Follow That Camel, an Indian in Up the Khyber, and a Sub-Saharan African in Up the Jungle. Kenneth Williams was critical of several Carry On films, despite his overall fondness for the series, primarily due to the low pay he and his fellow actors received. Many performers concerned about being typecast later regretted appearing in the films. Notable examples include Williams and Julian Holloway. John Pertwee, who made cameo appearances in Cleo, Cowboy, Screaming and Columbus, once described the series as hideous. Jack Douglas, meanwhile, disliked the last three films he appeared in, England, Emmanuel and Columbus, as they strayed too far from the original formula. Sid James and Barbara Windsor were involved in a decade-long affair. He even arranged to see her in Australia during her Carry On Barbara one-woman show, unable to tolerate the separation. Despite both being married, James to his wife and Windsor to gangster Ronnie Knight, James openly professed his love for her, even to her friends. Rumours claimed Ronnie Knight issued odd threats, such as rearranging James's furniture or leaving an axe in his floor, though close friends, including Vince Powell and William G. Stewart, have dismissed these stories. Several proposed Carry On films never advanced beyond early development. Some examples are Carry On Smoking, planned for 1961 and set in a fire station, was dropped without explanation. Carry On Again Nurse was attempted 3 times. The first version evolved into Carry On Doctor. A second, scripted in 1977, was cancelled after the failure of Carry On Emmanuel. And a final 1988 version, intended to reunite much of the original cast and include a tribute to Hattie Jacks, was abandoned after the deaths of Kenneth Williams and Charles Hawtrey, and concerns over its £1.5 million budget. Other abandoned ideas include Carry On Flying from 1962 about RAF recruits, Carry On Spaceman, a space race spoof written by Norman Huddis and twice revived without success, and Carry On Robin, a Robin Hood parody registered in 1965 but never pursued. Talbot Rothwell's Carry On Escaping from 1973 would have spoofed wartime escape films, and Carry On Dallas collapsed in 1980, when Dallas's production company, Lorimar, demanded an unaffordable royalty fee. Finally, Carry On Down Under reached the location scouting stage in Australia in 1981, before being shelved due to lost financing. Carry On Laughing was an attempt to bring the style of the Carry On films to television, running for 13 episodes across 2 series in 1975. The show was not particularly successful, partly because only around half of the regular film cast were involved, while longtime writer Talbot Rothwell had retired due to ill health. All the films were produced at Pinewood Studios near Iver Heath in Buckinghamshire. Budget limits meant much location shooting took place nearby. By the late 1960s, however, the franchise's growing ambition required more distant sites, such as Snowdonia in Wales, standing in for the Khyber Pass in Carry On Up the Khyber, and going really exotic, the Sussex coast doubled as the Sahara in Follow That Camel. Salary was always a contentious issue throughout the series. At the 40-year reunion of the remaining Carry On cast and crew, producer Peter Rogers jokingly remarked that he would have done anything for his performers, except pay them more. The late Kenneth Williams would have undoubtedly been appalled by the gag. When it comes to long-running film franchises, the Carry On series ranks second only to James Bond. Over the course of 34 years, the franchise produced 31 films, beginning with Carry On Sergeant in 1958 and concluding with Carry On Columbus in 1992. By comparison, the James Bond series has been producing films from 1962 to 2021, a span of 59 years, and continues to this day. Carry On Nurse in 1959 was the top-grossing film in the UK that year, and with an audience of 10.4 million, remains the most widely seen of all the Carry On films. Perhaps surprisingly, it also achieved considerable success in the US, where reports suggested it ran in some cinemas for as long as 3 years. For many fans, Carry On Cleo is regarded as the high point of the series. Once again, producer Peter Rogers' thriftiness paid off, as he boldly made use of leftover sets and costumes from Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's Cleopatra, which had moved to Italy to complete filming. Thanks to director Gerald Thomas's usual efficiency, the film reached cinemas ahead of its big-budget inspiration. The result is one of the most lavish Carry On productions, with a screenplay that is equally rich by the series' standards. The Carry On series entered the 1970s in relatively good shape, but the regular cast were aging and the formula was beginning to tire. Carry On Henry and Carry On at Your Convenience, both from 1971, followed by Carry On Matron in 72, still boasted strong ensembles. Yet the franchise stumbled with Carry On Abroad later that year. Carry On Girls then arrived in 1973, without Kenneth Williams, and leaned more heavily into risque humour. The end was then looming. Carry On Dick in 74 marked the final appearance of Barbara Windsor, Hattie Jacks and Sid James, who died 2 years later from a heart attack. It was also Talbot Rothwell's last script, and subsequent entries suffered from weaker writing, diminished star power, and a mismatch with the harsher tone of the 1970s. The nadir came with Carry On England in 1976, which introduced outright nudity, a move that felt like a desperate grab for relevance. After Kenneth Williams and Barbara Windsor hosted the clip show That's Carry On in 1977, only one film remained for the decade. Carry On Emmanuel from 1978 was a softcore spoof abandoning the charm and saucy postcard wit that defined the series, effectively ending its classic run. That is, of course, until the ill-fated revival arrived 14 years later in the form of Carry On Columbus. The Carry On stage shows emerged as a natural extension of the film series' immense popularity. Carry On London was the first, a comedy musical staged in 1973. Written by Talbot Rothwell, it featured familiar Carry On stars, including Sid James, Barbara Windsor and Kenneth Connor. Next came Carry On Laughing, The Slimming Factory in 1976, a straightforward stage farce trading on the Carry On name. Its timing was unfortunate. Sid James died just 2 months before the show opened. Most of the regular team were either unable or unwilling to take part, owing to other commitments or the impact of Sid's death. Finally, What a Carry On premiered in Blackpool in 1992, aiming to recapture the spirit of Carry On London, with a traditional music hall mix of sketches, songs, dances, and solo variety turns. An attempted revival film, Carry On London, was announced in 2003, but languished in pre-production for years. At different stages, Daniela Westbrook, David Jason, Sean Williamson, Burt Reynolds, Vinnie Jones and Shane Ritchie were all linked to the film. At the franchise's 50th anniversary in 2008, series-long Carry On producer Peter Rogers still hoped Carry On London would launch a new series, but the project collapsed after Rogers' death in April 2009. In 2016, producer Jonathan Sothcott announced a new reboot, starting with Carry On Doctors and Carry On Campus, but by April 2017, he confirmed he was no longer involved, and no further progress was reported. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Carry On series, the British Royal Mail honoured the iconic films by issuing a special set of postage stamps featuring the colourful and instantly recognisable posters from the movies. And there you have it, folks. You now know a little bit more about Carry On films. If you enjoyed the video, which I presume you did as you got this far, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos coming to Rocky Watches Movies. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.